Hi fellow engineers, and today we're going to be looking at constraints and how to efficiently constrain your geometry in Sketcher, in this Sketcher Workbench. So the constraints we'll be looking at are along here, this toolbar here, which is accessible through the views, toolbars, and there should be sketch constraints there. So I've got that tick there, so this is our different constraints along here. Remember that the arrow here shows a drop down for additional options on that master option there. So there's two types of constraint. There's a datum constraint where you actually supply some data, so like a length or a width or a height. So it's where you actually supply a value for the constraint, say 200 millimeters, 300 millimeters, etc. And there's also geometric constraints, which are symmetrical, horizontal, vertical, parallel, etc. So any constraint that doesn't take data will be a geometrical constraint. So we're going to actually start with some lines, and I'm going to show you how these constraints work. So first thing is I'm going to draw two lines. Now remember, all geometry, whether it's a square, a circle, etc., are made up of lines, so I can show you that now. So this geometry here is a square, and there's a number of constraints here on there. So these are geometry constraints that's been added to there. So I'm just going to remove these, and because I'm not going to get in depth with this at the moment. And now I've removed those, you can see that we still have a square, but it's more of a polygon in that we can actually adjust it to whatever shape we want. But if I remove the constraints on these vertices here, so if I delete those, you will now see it's just made up of lines. So that's exactly what we've got over here. Let's get rid of that and back to our two lines. So at the moment these are unconstrained, we can actually move them about our workbench. So the first thing I'm going to do is put a constraint on these two lines, and I'm going to use the horizontal constraint, to create a vertical constraint. So if I apply the vertical constraint on here, you can see now it's constrained vertically, and we can't actually rotate this at all because it's vertical to our workbench. We can still change the size, but it will stay vertically along there. The next one we do, this side, is put a horizontal constraint on. These are the easy ones. So the same as vertical, but it's constrained against the horizontal. So no rotation. We can stretch and unstretch this line as much as we want, but we will not stray from the horizontal axis. So to get rid of these constraints, just click on them and delete. And also if we go down here, we can actually see our constraints here. So at the moment I've got all constraints, and if I click on this constraint here, you can see the constraint has been highlighted. Sometimes it's handy to rename these. You can actually right click and rename these. So we'll just delete that constraint. So now we can freely move these about again. So I'm going to place these in parallel to each other, and I am going to create a parallel constraint between the two lines. So I click on these. These are not now locked in parallel. So if I move one, you can see that they end up in the same angle as each other. So if I move, oops, the bottom part, so no matter where I move these, they are now in parallel. Now I'm going to leave this parallel constraint on because I'm going to show you how to combine two constraints now. So if these are in parallel and I wanted to keep them the same length as each other, I can add something called an equality constraint on there, which is here. So creating a quality constraint between two lines, between two circles or arcs. So if I click these two, hit the quality constraint. Now if I increase and decrease the size of these, you can see that they stay in proportion with each other, they're equal. So we've got our parallel constraint and quality constraint working together there as one. So the other thing I want to show you is the perpendicular constraint, and what I'm going to do is actually remove this and add a square to the workbench. Oops. There we go. And I'm going to remove the current constraints that it has. And I'm going to remove the top section here. So now this can be moved about wherever we want. So I'm going to first put it in some obscure shape. There we go. So the first thing I want to do is make these run parallel to each other, because I want to create basically a kind of open square shape that I can actually rotate around the page. So the top of the square is open, but everything's in parallel, and the shape doesn't deform. So I'm going to click these two and create a parallel constraint. So these are now constrained. Oops. In parallel. So these two lines run in parallel to each other, and I am going to create a perpendicular constraint between these two lines here. That will mean that those two are now in perpendicular, so they will keep in a right angle to each other. There we go. So as you can see, I didn't have to actually add that constraint to this hand side, because obviously if one side is going to be kept in a right angle and the other side is in parallel, then you won't need to add that constraint to the right hand side. So the next thing I'm going to do is add a quality constraint against these two, so it keeps the sides equal to each other. And there we go, we've got the quality constraint in there. So they're in parallel, they're equal. We can change the size of the square, rotate it, and things are kept in the sides are kept in proportion with each other. So now we've done that, I'm going to have a look at a symmetrical constraint. So this one creates a symmetrical constraint between 2 points with respect to a line or a third point. So if I place a line in here, press escape to get my points back. I haven't attached this to the existing geometry yet, and obviously it has no effect. So I can actually click this line, and this line, and create a symmetry. Oh, sorry, it's the points. I have to actually click the points. Let's get rid of that. So click this point, and this line, and hit the symmetry, and that will be slap bang in the center between these two points here. So I can move this now, and you'll see that that will actually move and be symmetrical. Now my line moves up and down as I'm moving this, so I can actually attach this point to this line here by clicking on the point and the line and using the fix a point onto an object. So now we've created almost like a fork, and I can control that fork, which stays together in parallel with each other just by adding a few geometrical constraints. So I haven't had any line datum constraints yet, and it's best to do geometric constraints because you end up with less on the page and things keep in proportion with each other and in symmetry. So when you have more datum constraints, things start to get messy. You can delete one which has an effect on all the rest, and it can get quite confusing. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually add a circle in here. And to this circle I'm going to add a radius constraint, so I can make this 30 millimeters. So this is a datum constraint, so that will stay at 30 millimeters. And what I'm going to do is add a circle on here and try to fix a circle in this original circle. So another circle, and I'm going to make that, add a datum constraint to that one as well, of an arc. Sorry, no, I'll add a constraint on the diameter now. So the diameter of this is going to be 10 millimeters. So this one's got a radial constraint, this one's got a I forgot what it was now, diameter constraint. Okay, so 2 times radius basically. So that's sitting there. So, but I want to fix that in the circle. So the way I can do that is by I can attach it to the side here, but I actually want it away from this side. So to make things a lot easier on yourself, we can actually hide these constraints. So if we come down to our tasks, move down to our constraints, we can see the 2 constraints we've added here. So we can just uncheck these and these will hide them from view. So we can see what we're doing. So I want to fix this circle in here, so I need to add some structure inside to actually do that. So I'm going to add a polygon. So if we look up here, a polygon. So I'm going to go from here and up, press escape, and I'm going to fix this point to this circle with the fixer point onto an object, and I'm going to fix these 2 points together as well. So I've clicked both of those, and I'm going to select the so the point constraint here, and I'm going to fix these 2 as well. So the center of the actual master circle and the point where the 2 lines of the polygon meet. And then I can actually use a perpendicular constraint here, and now that is actually almost what I want. So I've almost fixed that in the position I want. Now to actually fix that here, I'm going to use a length constraint. So pick both of these points and hit the fixer length, and I'm going to go 20 on there. So now that's fixed in the actual center of the circle. And to clean up, click on your constraint. You can see in this the section view, this is available from the tools, the view, panels, selection view, we can see the constraint we picked there, and also we can look down here and see a constraint highlighted, so we can uncheck that. So that's all nice and constrained there. And the other thing I'm going to do is constrain this to the center of the sketch. So the best idea is to move it close to the center of the sketch, because you can actually get some obscure behavior with FreeCAD if it's miles away from the center. So click that and click the center of a sketch. And if you look over here, I've clicked something else, so I want to, there's 3 items selected here which I don't want. So let's try that again, so we can see the 2 are selected, and constrained to the middle. And now that's nice and constrained in there, so we can actually rotate that around. And we've got our other object here. So obviously rotating the sketch like this has an effect on other objects that are constrained to constrained to that geometry that you're actually rotating. So if I moved this over here and constrained those 2 points, when we rotate this now, our other geometry will rotate as well. FreeCAD can be a bit interesting with when you're dragging objects. If you click and drag in increments, then you get a better control over the actual dragging. So you can see how it's having an effect. Okay, so we've gone through the vertical, horizontal, we've gone and fixed a point onto an object. We've actually used the point constraint here to actually constrain 2 points together or 2 vertices together. We've talked about the parallel constraint, we've talked about the perpendicular constraint, and we've talked about the symmetry and the actual equality constraint there. One of them we haven't done is the tangent constraint between 2 entities. So a tangent constraint, so if I had a arc, look for the arc tool, and I'm going to create an arc here, and I'm going to create 2 lines. Now I can use the tangent constraint to actually connect these 2 together. Okay, and also on this side. No, let me just undo that. So let's come. So press escape too many times. So now I've got this tangent constraint here. That means that this will keep nicely connected. As you can see on the edge of the stage, it's almost like it's an extension of the arc. So also if we try to do it with the actual lines itself, you can see it's actually attached the line to that arc at that point. So you can use it with lines, the actual sides of the arc itself and a line or another arc, or you can use it on the points. So it's 2 ways of attaching there. Let me just show you with another arc or a circle. So I created a circle, and what I'm going to do is just bring this down so it's touching. Click both and add a tangent there. So now this circle has been attached to that arc. I can actually move around the top of the arc just by dragging the circle. Right, let's get rid of that. So the other constraints we got are mainly datum constraints up here. So if I wanted to fix the size of this length here, I can actually go out to the length constraint, add that in as 40. So that's now all fixed. So if I rotate this now, that will keep 40 millimeters all the time. So that length there. So you can see we've got a kind of almost like a piston movement from just using constraints. So the other one that I want to talk about, if I place a square on here, is get rid of the current constraints on the square. So at the moment is a unconstrained square, is the horizontal distance between 2 points or line ends. So if I click this line, place a horizontal distance in there, and say 50, and I can do the same with this line here as well, so 50 there. So we fix the height and the width of that line, but what we've got to remember is that if we're using, how can I explain this, that line, although we fix the height of that line, so obviously if we take it off at an angle, you can see this line is longer. So height and length are only really suitable if you're constraining along the horizontal and vertical axis. So if I wanted to make sure that this stays along the horizontal axis, we know that this length will always be 50 millimeters. Because we haven't constrained along the vertical, this will stay 50 millimeters high, but the length of this will change. So it's really a high constraint, but don't get it mixed up with length constraint on the diagonal. If you want to constrain this length here, then you would actually use the length constraint. Angle constraints. So if I wanted this to be a certain angle, I would just click both these sides here and add an angle constraint. Again, this is a datum constraint, so I'm going to have this at 100 degrees, and now we've fixed that angle there at 100 degrees. So no matter where I move this, this will always be 100 degrees. Okay. So creating a buckle constraint will actually stop the item from actually moving from the actual page. So if we look here at the moment, we've actually got this quite mobile, this geometry here. So to lock this down, if I select the top here and hit the create a block constraint, this will now stop you from actually moving this item around. And the same for here, we've got quite a lot of mobility in this sketch. So if I actually create a block constraint on, say, this circle here, I won't be able to move that, but I'll be able to move other parts of the sketch that are actually connected to it, because the block constraint isn't applied to this geometry, it's only applied to this part of the geometry. Now, one thing to note around a block constraint, if I start adding constraints here, I will be, say if I had an angle constraint in here, I won't be able to do it unless I remove that block constraint. So I'll show you this. So the first thing to do is, when troubleshooting errors like this, so if I add this angle constraint in here, you'll see an arrow up here, and 90 degrees. So datum 90 degrees for constraint with index 26 is invalid. So if we're looking at this, so look at constraint 26, scroll down here, you see constraint 26 is a block constraint. Now if I rename this, say block constraint, small circle, so I rename this constraint now, and you can see the names come up actually here. So if we do the same again, angle 90 degrees, so if you look at this, for the constraint with index 26 is invalid. So the trouble is we've renamed that now, so we've got a bit of a problem because we can't actually find block constraint 26 in here. So just be aware, you may want to, when you rename any constraints, include the index in here for reference back. You can actually, if I click on the block constraint here, it actually says up in the section view which constraint it is, but for quick reference you can actually just rename these. Make sure you add the index in there so it's easy to find what the constraint is. As well as block constraints, you've actually got lock constraints as well. So this one here, so what a lock constraint will do, will actually lock the geometry in reference to the center of the of origin. So these lines here, these are your axis lines. So now there we go, there's the sketch axis lines. So for me to lock this geometry, let's take off this block constraint a minute. So if I want to lock this geometry here, let's just reattach those lines. If I want to lock this geometry here, I can select this point and I can hit create a lock constraint, and what will that do, will actually apply a width and a height in relation to the center of origin of the sketch. So now I can't actually move this at all. I can move the other constraints or the other vertices, not a problem at all, but that point will stay in relation of where it's placed. It's good for circles. So if I had a circle here and I wanted to lock that position there, I would actually just apply a lock constraint, and therefore I can't actually move that circle. So I can have things rotating around this circle, but the circle itself I can't actually move it. I've literally pinned this axis to the sketch itself. So that's a lock constraint for you, and I think that is all the constraints that there is. So hopefully this video would have been of help, and see you in the next tutorial.